going to be talking about the final report from this year's Louisiana Survey. I'm going to give just a little bit of a brief introduction about sort of the survey itself as a project before I get into really the nuts and bolts of this particular report. So the Louisiana Survey, it's an annual project. It's been going on, as was mentioned, since 2003, but it's a project of the Riley Center for Media and Public Affairs at LSU's Manship School of Mass Communication. And the Riley Center, and really I'm going to say this to help explain how this survey came to be, the Riley Center is really this unique institution at LSU. It plays a special role, particularly in trying to bridge the gap that sometimes emerges between sort of what happens in the ivory tower, if you will, and what's going on in sort of the applied world of public affairs and policy. And what the center tries to do is really sort of work that gap from both sides, to sort of bring faculty research to bear on issues of public concern in the state and the nation, but also to bring in players and actors in the world of public affairs to the university, as well to inform us. So for example, tomorrow night, the Riley Center is hosting an event where they're bringing in two former presidential press secretaries, Mike Murray from the Clinton administration and Ari Fleischer from President George W. Bush's administration, to come and talk to faculty, students, and the public at large about the role of the presidential press secretary in government communications, which is a pretty interesting topic, especially now, and what we see going on in presidential politics today. So that's an example of the kind of work that the Riley Center does a bunch of programming. And another example is the Louisiana Survey. And the Louisiana Survey is something the Riley Center has sponsored and undertaken since 2003. So for 15 years now, they've been doing this. I've only been fortunate enough to be part of it for the last 4, but it has a much longer history. And really the scope of the Louisiana Survey is to track trends and attitudes, sort of global attitudes about what people think about the nature of politics and government in the state. You know, how do they think Louisiana is doing? So it's a survey of Louisiana residents. How do they think the state is doing in terms of quality of life, in terms of government services, in terms of their satisfaction with the direction of the state and with their vision for where the state should go. But then also to tap in on attitudes and preferences and thoughts on issues of the day. So for this year already, this is our 6th and final report from this year's survey, which was done mostly in the month of February. But so far this year, we've released our first report was on public attitudes about sort of the state of Louisiana politics and what they think about compromise or the chances for compromise, what they think about polarization, what they think about how our government is doing. And I'm sure you all read that report, but if you didn't, you probably have a pretty good guess of what we found. The second report was about solutions, what the public thinks of in terms of the fiscal cliff that the state faces. And we often type attitudes on spending and taxes and those sorts of policies. And we found, as we often do, that public thinking on issues of fiscal affairs are every bit as convoluted, complex, and messy as the problems of fiscal affairs that the state is facing themselves are. We've looked at, this year, we were able to look at changes and attitudes about issues related to gender and gender discrimination, equality in the workplace, equality in the economy, particularly in the wake of the Me Too movement. We've looked at, we measured attitudes towards 2 really the signature major policy initiatives of the Edwards administration, criminal justice reform and Medicaid expansion. So those are the issues we've covered so far. The one that I want to do today takes us in a different direction. Instead of talking about what the public thinks about government and politics, we're talking about what the government thinks about, well, some of you in here, what the government thinks about media. But we mean sort of like media and local media in terms of like how much they trust. So it's not like we went and asked like, hey, do you approve or disapprove? What is your favorability rating of Lanny Keller? That would have been a great question. I would have enjoyed that one. But we didn't do that. We asked people about how much trust they have in their local media, how accurate they believe local media reporting is on political issues, policy issues, and if they believe that local media essentially is biased, or whether they treat different sides differently or cover all sides fairly. And we modeled our questions on questions that the Pew Research Center asks of national surveys. So that way we could make comparisons between what Louisianians think and what the country at large thinks. But I think it was really to sort of give the context of why we did this, which is a little bit different from what we often ask about. And I think many of us in this room would agree, whether you're someone who engages with the media, whether you're someone who works in the media, whether you're someone like me who studies politics and a democracy, the media arguably play an essential role in a representative democracy. I think most of us in this room would share that idea. We go about our lives on a day-to-day basis, and we're not going to encounter every bit of potentially vital information about every issue the state faces or the country faces. Right? If we're going to understand those issues, if we're going to be able to use our thoughts on those issues, either to hold government accountable or to choose representatives that reflect our interests, then we need to know about those issues. And most of us aren't going to get that in the day-to-day run of our lives as we're coaching soccer games, showing up to work, sitting in traffic, right? You have to get that from somewhere else. And the place we turn for that is media. That's where we get a lot of that information. And so it's important, right, given that role, and then you add to that sort of the state of media in America today, where we're seeing shrinking newsrooms, particularly when it comes to state house reporting, shrinking newsrooms across the country, right? We got that going on. Another challenge is we have the rise of deliberate misinformation campaigns, often referred to as fake news. We have that going on. And then we have some political leaders and some other individuals outside of politics explicitly criticizing and attacking the media. So in this context, we think it's of value to try to understand what does the public think about the media in this state. Do they think they can get the information they need from the media in this state? What are their attitudes about the media in this state in terms of trust, accuracy, perceptions of bias? And so I'm going to take you sort of those three topics. But first I want to tell you just a little bit about how we did this. So this is a sample of Louisiana adult residents. And we split our sample, randomly assigned people to two different batteries of questions. They were either asked these questions about media nationally, in the United States, nationally, what do you think about media, media organizations, news organizations, or they were asked about their own local news organizations, right? And so we can compare those responses to the people that got those two different batteries to see, are there differences in how people think about their own local media and its coverage of local and state politics and political issues versus how they think of the national media covers national politics and political issues. I'm going to give you the giveaway at the end is like, it's kind of a mixed bag. And you can walk away from it, if you're an optimist, you can walk away from it sort of with a glass half full perspective. But you can also walk away with it, as I do, with a glass half empty kind of perspective. So at the end, I'll sort of come back and explain exactly what I mean by those two things. So first, let's talk a little bit about trust in the media. And so we asked this question, basically it's just, how much do you trust the media for the information you need about politics and political affairs? And people could say, oh, I trust the media a lot, oh, I trust the media some, oh, not very much, or not at all. Well, overall, and I'll just preface by saying, we know from decades of polling nationally that Americans as a whole, their trust in media has declined really since the 70s. It's picked up, the rate of that decline has accelerated in recent years, but it's been on the decline since the 70s. And also, there's been an increasing gap between what Democrats and Republicans in this country think about the media. And that also has accelerated in recent years. Okay, but let's focus on Louisiana. So what do Louisianians think? Do they trust their local media in this state? Well, 22% of Louisiana residents trust local media a lot, and another 56% trusted some. So we're going to put those together and say that about 4 out of every 5 state residents have at least some modest level of trust in local media. So most people are saying, yeah, okay, I trust local media. And we can compare that to what Louisiana residents think about the media nationally. And the numbers are much better for local media than they are for media nationally. So only 14% of Louisiana residents trust the national news organizations a lot, 43% some. Put them together and you've got about 3 out of 5. About 3 out of 5 Louisiana residents really have sort of any body of trust in national media, so less than trust local media. So we could take some heart in that, right? Local media sort of trusted more than national media, but I think given where we started with the concerns about the role media play in a democracy, I think the fact that we're talking about 1 out of every 5 adult residents of the state just doesn't trust the media they have access to at the local level. That's alarming. Because if they don't trust that, where are they going to go get the information they need? We can look at it and break it out by party, and you can see that part of what's going on here is partisan politics, but it's not strictly partisan politics. So for example, the gap between how much people trust the national media and the local media, or local versus national, is much bigger among Republicans in Louisiana than Democrats. So Democrats, 89% trust local media, and 78% trust national media. So there's a little bit of a difference between local and national, but it's not real big. For Republicans, it's a much bigger difference. Republicans, 76% of Republicans trust local media, and only 47% trust national media. So there's partisanship is playing into this to some extent, but it's not going to explain all of this, the gap between sort of local and national. All right, now let's talk about the clearest piece of good news, and that has to do with perceptions of accuracy. So we asked people, again, modeling on the Pew surveys, we asked people, do you think that your local media generally gets the facts straight, or do you think they're often inaccurate? And they sort of had to pick the one that came closest to their own views. Again, we asked some people about local media, some people about national media. So when asked about local media, a majority of individuals say that local media generally gets the facts straight. That is, they're accurate, right? 56% of Louisiana residents say, okay, local media is reporting the truth. And 37% say that it's often inaccurate. Those numbers flip when you ask about national media. In Louisiana, a majority of Louisiana residents, 63%, say the national news reporting is often inaccurate, and only 32% say that they generally get the facts straight. So that's not good. But from the perspective of local media, you can go, hey, look, we're beating out national media. Most Louisianans generally think that local news reporting is truthful, is accurate. What's also interesting about perceptions of accuracy is this attitude is bipartisan at the local level. 59% of Republicans also believe local media is generally accurate on covering these issues. 64% of Democrats believe local media is accurate. There's a big partisan difference on the national media. So 62% of Louisiana Democrats think the national media is accurate, pretty much the same amount that think local media is accurate. But when you ask Louisiana Republicans what they think about the accuracy of the national news organizations, my oh my, 14% say that that the national news organizations generally get the facts straight, right? So there's a big partisan divide in perceptions of the national media, but our local media has been insulated from that. Right, we're not seeing Republicans and Democrats disagree to a great extent about the accuracy of reporting when it comes to how their local news organizations are covering state politics and state policy. Okay, so the third component, the final component, has to do with perceptions of bias, and this is probably the most problematic of the three concepts we're walking through here. Overall, 60% of Louisiana residents think their local news organizations favor one side, right? That they're not being fair and they've got their thumb on the scale. So a majority think that local news organizations favor one side. 63% of Republicans say so, only 47% of Democrats say so, so there is a partisan gap there. Again, the numbers aren't as harsh as they are if you look at how Louisianians evaluate national media, where 79% say national news organizations tend to favor one side. 58% of Democrats, so a majority of Democrats in the state, also think the national news organizations tend to favor a side, have some bias, and then a whopping 93% of Louisiana Republicans think national news organizations are essentially biased in how they cover political news. So the numbers aren't as stark as that when you ask about local media, but there's still majority saying, no, there's imbalance here, there's a lack of fairness here. So when you put these three things together, as I said, I think you can walk away from this sort of with a glass half full or a glass half empty perspective. So on the glass half full perspective, it's like, okay, so things aren't as bad as they could be, right? We look at how people think about national news media, and it's like, wow, that's pretty rough terrain. They don't evaluate local news media as harshly. So hey, it could be worse, right? So there's your optimist take. Now my take's a little different. My take is that we should be concerned about this. Now, I'll preface this by saying none of this is data that tells us anything about whether or not local news reporting is actually accurate or actually biased or should be trusted. This is just what people think. But in a democracy where people need to turn to media to get information, we need to care about what people think about those sources of information. And so I walk away from this a little bit more concerned than the optimists take, because I take these numbers and say, like, wow, there's a significant lack of trust here, even if it's not as widespread as it could be. There's significant perceptions, feelings that there's some bias in reporting. And then you couple that with data we've seen in the Louisiana survey from this year on other topics, such as their trust in state government is quite low. Some of the lowest we've seen on record in the Louisiana survey. What's more, trust in ourselves, meaning that like how the public, we ask people, how do you think that everybody else in Louisiana, how do you think about the citizens of Louisiana? How much trust do you have in the citizens of Louisiana to make wise political decisions? And those numbers are alarmingly low. Media is actually trusted more than people trust other citizens. But when you put those things together, that gives me pause. That gives me concern in a democratic society where we increasingly don't trust our fellow citizens, we don't trust our government, and we're seeing less and less trust in our media. That's a dark place. I don't know where that road ends, but on its own, it's hard to see it ending in a friendly place. So I'll just end by saying all of these results from this survey, this report, and the previous 5 reports, and indeed all our results from the 15 years of the Louisiana survey going back to 2003 are available online. pprllsu.com. Projects, you can see every Louisiana reports on every Louisiana survey since 2003 there, and that's where you can find this information, the report I handed out here today, and again any of those others. And so now I'll be happy to take any questions you have about this particular report, or really about anything we've covered so far in this year's Louisiana survey. Yes, ma'am. So it's a great question. So the question is, how do people who take the survey, what are they thinking about when they hear this phrase, national news organizations? Who do they have in mind? What are they thinking about? So we don't ask that directly here. We don't measure that directly here, but there's a bunch of research that's been done on this by the Pew Research Center and other Pew-related entities that have spent decades studying how people think about media and consume media. And the best evidence there suggests that when people are asked about national news organizations, they're thinking about things like the national broadcast news networks. They're thinking about things like the national cable news network, CNN, Fox News. And they're thinking about things like the New York Times and the Washington Post. It doesn't necessarily mean they're reading those things, but that's sort of who they have in mind when they think of national news organizations. But it's kind of this amorphous glob of just sort of that media. Now, what's also interesting is not everybody's thinking about the exact same organizations, right? And so when you ask, so for example, in national surveys, when you ask Fox News viewers about national news organizations, sort of as a generic label, they're not thinking about Fox News. They're thinking about CNN and the New York Times, right? Fox News is different. But if you ask Democrats and non-Fox News viewers about what they think of when they think of national news organizations, you're sort of getting a mix that may or may not include things like Fox News. So it's important to remember that people do answer these questions in a little bit different ways depending on what specific organizations they have in mind. But the best evidence suggests it's just sort of this non-specific, just sort of grouping of like media elites is what people are thinking about when they hear the phrase national news organizations. Does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
Can you clarify when you ask this question, is it relative to politics or is it relative to the latest emergency incident, or airplane crash? I mean, there are all types of news.
That's correct.
And so are we trying to distinguish all news or just political news in this survey?
That's correct. So this section of the questionnaire, the first question about this is asking about how well informed they think media keeps them. Those numbers are similar to the trust in news numbers. The reason I mention it here is that does preface talking about important stories of the day about state politics. And so that's sort of the way we're trying to frame the conversation we're having with our respondents. And then during the interview, we do remind them specifically when we get to the bias question, in presenting the news dealing with political and social issues, do you think that local or national, depending on which question they're getting, news organizations deal fairly with all sides? So we are trying to make sure we're focused on how political news is being covered. But does that mean every respondent is thinking about it that way? I think probably so, given the measures we take, but of course we certainly can't guarantee that there aren't some people that are just thinking about like, oh yeah, I don't know if I trust that reporting about the plane crash or whatnot. Or I really don't like how WVLA covers, they should cover more LSU baseball or something, so you know, who knows what they bring to the table. But we do try to focus them on, I don't mean to pick on WVLA's coverage of LSU sports. I just, first one that left to mind. We do, because of your exact concern, we try to make sure we can keep them focused on thinking about that kind of news coverage. It's a great question. It's Jerry.
Is there a way for the media to say the media, you're talking about this huge field that you said, but for the media to turn around the perceptions other than continuing to try to do a good job? How do you reverse this?
So the question is, what can the media do? How can you reverse these trends? To be honest, Jerry, I was hoping you could answer that question. I wish I had a good answer to that question, and I would have to turn to people with careers and expertise in media to sort of help us figure the way out. If it's left up to me, I'm not very hopeful that we'll get there. I'm not sure. There's a tension here, right? On the one hand, you want to be responsive to what people think. On the other hand, I can tell you, if I was a news organization and I was reading these numbers, my first reaction, maybe because I'm a defensive guy, but my first reaction would be like, well, how do we know they're right? They might believe that, but we should care on whether or not they're right. Now, to be fair, we ask these questions about how local media are doing, forcing some of you to take your medicine. We often ask Louisiana residents how they think higher education's doing, so we have to take our own medicine too. I wonder how much of these perceptions of bias and perceptions of accuracy and willingness to trust are a reflection of the day's politics and political predispositions and partisanship and ideology. And so what can you do? If you are accurate and you are unbiased, and again, none of this tells us one way or the other whether or not specific news organizations are, but if you are, then I don't know what you can do to convince somebody who doesn't believe you are that you are, especially given they're already predisposed to not listen to you and not believe you, right? So it's tough. I don't know how you turn. And this to me is one of the reasons that this, not just here in Louisiana, but when you look at the national trends, this is disturbing because I don't know how you reverse that trend. Because the people who would be making the case are the people that those who need to have the case made to them are going to be least like. So that was super academically phrased. It makes no sense. It's just convoluted, lots of clause after clause after clause. So let me try again. News organizations would have to convince people who already don't trust news organizations that in fact news organizations are doing a good job. And you need someone else to make that case. And I don't know who else that might be. Yes, sir.
I have a question, and this is not about national politics, but I guess you could call it local, but then we're dealing with Baton Rouge, and that's the state capital, so I take it maybe a little bit more than just local, but it's in the state. But anyway, with regard to perceptions of that media, do you believe that, for instance, a newspaper can kind of take its lumps and rise and fall based on what its viewers, what its readers view the opinions of the editorial columns? For instance, a few weeks ago, there was a lot of people just clamoring and advocate for a particular columnist in North Louisiana who really, I got to stop reading. And a lot of people have too. But do you think it's that kind of thing that kind of, results in the problem?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. So the question, if I understand it correctly, is, are the fate of news organizations, newspapers, or could be other news organizations as well, really tied to how people respond to coverage, particularly sort of editorial and opinion coverage, right? If they dislike what they're hearing, the opinions expressed, if they disagree with them, can they essentially punish that news organization by no longer using it? I've actually never seen any study of that exactly. I would love to. Like that, someone should do that study. That's a really good idea. But to see if people, if subscribers, or really consumption as well as subscription shifts in relation to editorial content, and I can immediately envision a number of ways you might go about trying to test that across a bunch of media markets and media entities. But I can see why you suspect, or why one might suspect that it would be the case, especially today where we have so many options on where do we go to get information, that it's easy for us to just go like, you know what, I'm tired of reading what Lanny writes in The Advocate, because he's always wrong. So I'm going to go find something else that I'm going to read.
You know what I'm talking about. Everybody knows what I'm talking about.
That was just, I don't know who he's talking about, so I just picked your name because I know your name. So, you know, I imagine it's easier. There's easier to, the consumer has access to a broader market of outlets, and so it's easy. And we know that on the national level, people do pick to choose to watch Fox News or CNN based on their political predispositions. So I imagine the same thing could happen at the local level as well. But I've never seen sort of clear empirical evidence that it does happen at the local level, and that it happens particularly in response to editorials and opinion pages. But it's a great question. I apologize.
I was, since we're talking about trust, I was struck by the number 11% of completed interviews. Is that
Yep.
correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you say that that is fairly standard. Doesn't that reflect, does that reflect either the busyness of lives or the fact that people frankly don't trust telephone interviewers?
Touche. So this is another great idea for an empirical project. So the question is, so the response rate for this survey is 11% of eligible participants elected to participate in the survey. And the question is, does that response rate reflect a lack of trust in polling or pollsters? It could, but I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so, there's a couple of reasons I don't think so. The first is that so again, 11% is a pretty good response. I know, it doesn't sound great, right? But it's pretty good for telephone interviewing today, which again, in most cases is going to be depending on how you manage your sampling and how you manage how you do it and what kind of phone numbers you're calling and you're hitting cell and landline. It's still sort of the best approach for most situations is to try to go it by the telephone. It's not, in every specific case, it's not always the best, but particularly with localized or state level populations, it's usually the best. Incredibly expensive, but the best. And in those kinds of surveys, 11% is a pretty good thing. You can go out and you can pick up a lot of polls that you can find covered in the news, and you'll find surveys with response rates of 4% or 3% or 5%. 11% is pretty solid. Anything north of 10 is pretty solid these days. But the two reasons I don't think that's what's going on here, but I can't say that it's not for sure, is that the response rates have been declining for decades in ways that don't seem to reflect the growing polarization and attitudes towards media. They seem, because they've declined and they've taken specific bumps at times, and the things that seem to drive them are the biggest thing. There's sort of two things that go together that really walloped telephone survey response rates. It's the rise of just telemarketing, and then the real one is caller ID. Even before we had it all on our cell phones, when we could get it on our landlines. And you can look, you can see the moments in time where it's declining, it's like, whoops, it's like, oh, caller ID becomes widespread. So the next question then is, even if it's not driven by that, are we getting different responses because we're not getting 89% of eligible participants? That's hard to study, but some people that are way smarter than me, with the American Association of Public Opinion Research, some survey methodologists and social scientists at Stanford got together about a decade ago and did a study where they did their telephone interviews, found out their non-respondents, and then went and tried to find them another way and get to them. And they could compare if the people who didn't elect to take the survey are fundamentally different on the people who did. And you imagine it might vary a little bit by topic of the survey, but generally that differences aren't very big. It's almost sort of random on who just decides, man, I want want to take the survey, or sure, I'll do it. Now, that was a decade ago, and response rates have continued to decline. And every time they come down another point and another year goes by and they're coming down lower on average, we need to go back and do studies like that again to be sure that the new people we're missing really aren't different in some systematic way. So those are the two reasons that I don't think that's what's going on here, but I think it's a great idea to try to find out if people's trust in pollsters are declining. But boy, that's hard to do, because if you try to do it by a poll, you sort of, right? It's kind of a catch-22 there. It's a great question, though. Yes, sir?
How did you qualify the respondents in the survey? I mean, are they actual media users? I mean, do they actually read the newspaper, watch the TV broadcast, and that? I mean,
So-
because I know that people will want to appear intelligent and say, oh yeah, I read the newspaper all the time, when they don't even have a subscription.
So the question is, how are people eligible to participate in the survey, and is there some measure of sort of media consumption that determines that? The answer to that is no. Eligibility, so this was meant to be a general population sample of Louisiana residents. So the only qualifications are A, you're an adult, and B, you live in Louisiana. And that's it. And if you were, then you are, and you consent to take the survey. Those are the people who are eligible for the survey. They can take the survey whether or not they actually read the news. Now, we do ask people how much they consume news about local state and local political issues, and so we could absolutely break responses to the media trust questions out by that. But there's two problems with that, and one of which you raise is that people might be misrepresenting their consumption of news when you ask them how much do you read the news. But nonetheless, we could break them out and see if people who consume more news are less critical or more critical of media. The other issue with that is that it's related to that. It's that I wouldn't know how to interpret results that suggest. So let's say we found that people who pay less attention to media trust media less. I wouldn't necessarily take that to mean they're less informed about media and therefore distrust media. It could be that they read media less because they distrust media, and we wouldn't be able to parse that out in a survey. Now, one thing we can do, and so I'm getting a lot of great ideas here today. So one thing we can do is we ask in different areas of the survey on just different policy topics, we ask knowledge questions. Essentially, how much do people know about what's going on with state spending or state fiscal health? Do they know the state expanded Medicaid? Just a number of sort of questions like that scattered throughout the survey. So one thing we could do is look to see if people who are more informed and sort of by objective measures of sort of knowledge, are they people who are also reading the media, or paying more attention to local and state media? And if so, are they more or less trusting in local or state media, or local media, I guess. Yes, sir.
So did you find a fairly high degree of knowledge? And would you say that the responses, given the fact that you split the sample groups, would you say that the responses about national media reflect a very strong kind of parochialism?
So there's two questions there. A, if we found on those other knowledge-related questions in the survey, if we found that people were knowledgeable. And B, whether or not the attitudes towards national media might reflect parochialism. These are both very great questions. So on the first one, I can say generally no. And we find this a lot. We've always asked some sort of knowledge questions. So for example, only about a third of Louisiana adults know that the state expanded the Medicaid, expanded the state's Medicaid program within the last few years. That's pretty low given how significant that is as a policy issue, and also how much it's sort of becoming a point of political debate. So that would suggest that people are not well informed. And then we asked them about how Louisiana's sales taxes compare to other states. They know some about that. We asked them how income tax compares to other states. Not super great. And so we ask these kinds of questions, and knowledge is generally less robust than we probably would like to see among a citizenry. I'm not surprised by that because, again, people live their lives. And these issues may impact them in serious ways, but in terms of their day-to-day lives, if they're not making those connections, then they're sitting in the traffic, coaching the soccer game, doing whatever they're doing, right? And it's hard to find the incentive to go and study up on all these issues, even if they may impact your lives. So it doesn't surprise me that people are not particularly well informed about politics, and you can see that in decades of polling in Louisiana, across the country. That's just sort of a fact. There are exceptions, but usually what you find is people are not particularly well informed about policy issues. Now, the second part of the question, I do think it probably does, that part of what's going on could be that people like local media more because it's local and dislike national media more because it's not theirs, it's somewhere else. And the reason I think so is because you find that in a lot of other kinds of polls and surveys that have nothing to do with media, where you ask people to like evaluate how good do you think public schools in America are? Not so great. How good do you think your public schools are? Well, a lot of people are like, better than that. And so you can see how people, hate Congress. And this is not just now, this is always. They hate Congress. But boy, oh boy, they love their member of Congress, right? So like their thing they like, this sort of bigger, abstract, generalized thing they don't like as much. That's probably in part what's going on here. But the fact that we're seeing this thing sort of break out by party the way that it does suggests that it's also, I think, and because we're seeing the change in that over time, suggests to me that it's not just a parochialism, that that's part of it, but it's also just how people are responding to political events in society.
On the numbers related to the perception of national media by party, reported high numbers of Democrats of the national media now doing an acceptable job, whereas the Republicans are low. How did that compare in the Obama administration and then in the Bush administration in your survey? Like you said, it goes back to 2003.
That's correct. So the question is, how have these patterns of partisanship in perceptions of media, how have they changed over time, particularly during the Obama and Bush administrations? In the Louisiana survey, we have not asked these batteries of questions since 2003, so I can't tell you about the state, but lots of organizations like the Pew Research Center and Gallup have asked these questions to national samples. So I can tell you across the country what has tended to happen, and my suspicion is Louisiana has probably played out the same way, but I have no evidence, I have no data to confirm that. What we have seen is it's not quite what I would have guessed. I would have guessed is you'd essentially find people flip-flop based on the administration, but that's not exactly what you see. You've seen a decline among all both Democrats and Republicans over the last several decades and across different administrations, whether a Democrat or Republicans in. That decline has been more rapid among Republicans. So over time, everybody's trusting media less, but Republicans especially so. And they didn't get a bounce back up during the Obama administration. Everybody still continued to decline. But then you get to see the one bit that suggests that partisanship is playing into this in sort of based on administration is there has been a recent pretty significant jump in Democratic trust in the media since President Trump took office, which suggests to me that that's partly, that's partisanship, right? It's just like, well, if I'm a Democratic voter who doesn't like the president and the president attacks the media, well, then I'm going to defend the media, right? And so we have seen that shift in the change of the current administration, but we really had not seen a shift like that as other administrations changed. It was more of a steady decline for both Democrats and Republicans, just more steep for Republicans. Yes, sir.
This question maybe follows up on what you were just getting at, and what you asked. Just a couple of years ago, it might have been out there, but it was a general lexicon terms like fake news and alternative facts and stuff. Okay. I guess my question is, do you think that that's been a major contributing factor that every day we're hearing fake news stories and alternative facts? Get in there.
So the question is, are these trends driven by sort of the rise of hearing about things like fake news, alternative facts? My answer is probably a very unsatisfying yes and no. So the no is that these trends were happening beforehand, before these sort of terms came around, before we've seen the sort of explosion of bots and things like that. So that suggests to me that it isn't strictly just a response to the rise of deliberate misinformation campaigns. However, that being said, we've seen this stuff accelerate over the last couple of years, which is the same time period that's happening. So I do think it plays a role, but I don't think it's the only thing driving it, but it seems to be speeding it up. 2 questions related to the sort of the method of the survey. The first is how long does it take to answer the survey? And the second is the survey, are the callers LSU students? So to answer your first question, it takes about 24 minutes on average, which is a significant amount of time. Now we tell our participants at the beginning of the survey that that's what it's going to take, which is probably partly why it's 11% instead of, we often get 18, 19% response rates, but that's on 5 to 10 minute surveys. If you're asking for a more significant amount of time, those response rates come down some. So it does take a significant chunk of time. We do that because this is really our flagship survey, our signature survey, and we have a lot we feel like that's worth understanding. And the harder part is not getting someone to stay on the phone. It's getting someone to agree to take the survey in the first place. So we're upfront and say, look, this is going to take a significant amount of time. But if they're willing to say yes, then we're going to try to keep them on for 24 minutes and just learn as much as we can about a range of topics, given that we're only doing this once a year. The second question, the answer is no, it is not. I should say it is not strictly done by LSU students. We have a call center, the Public Policy Research Lab at LSU, and it employs both students and non-students as their callers. The relative balance shifts, depending on a seasonal basis. We have fewer students in the summer, but generally we try to make sure that students never make more than 50% of our caller force at any given time. Partly because now our LSU students are incredibly sharp. I was one myself, so they're fantastic callers, and I wish they would all come work for us. That being said, students have busy lives that change a lot, and we tend to get our student workers to work for us for a semester, maybe a year, and then they move on to other opportunities. And like anything else, callers improve with experience. It might not sound like much, you're just talking on the phone, right? No, it's really how you sell it that gets someone to agree to take the survey, and that comes with experience. And so we like to make sure we have a good chunk of our calling force being non-students that are with us for a significant period of time.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, sir.
Even the national surveys have biases. You can see which one is favored Republican and which one is favored Democrats. Why is this? Why can't we just have surveys unbiased?
Well, wow, that's a fantastic question, and it's the one that I probably have not enough time to answer, so I'm going to give a sort of a quick one. The answer is why do we have biases in surveys? Some surveys seem to be more favorable to Democrats, some more towards Republicans. Why can't we just get a straight answer? So we call those kinds of biases, we call them house effects in the business. That's kind of jargony. It comes down to how they conduct their samples. It comes down to how they try to solicit individuals to participate in their surveys. And oftentimes it comes down to how they choose to ask the questions, and wording matters so much. Responses shift, and sometimes a lot, based on how exactly you ask the question. So it's easy to move the needle in ways that favor one side or the other. I would argue that there are a number of strong survey institutions out there that are not biased in sort of a political sense, and that I tend to trust those more than I trust surveys that have explicit partisan associations, meaning they often work for campaigns or tend to work, be more associated with one side than the other. Pew Research Center is an example of that. Gallup is an example of that. The National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago is an example of that. But there's a number of them like that. The other thing that I like to do is, this is why I think it's important to not just look at one survey, but to sort of look at a bunch of surveys, average across surveys. That's going to give us a better sense of trying to cut out some of these biases and see where the numbers are. But you're absolutely correct that it's so easy to manipulate, but that's why we need to take care as consumers of surveys, as people who conduct surveys, and as people who report on surveys, to make sure we're aware of the kinds of biases you're bringing up, so we can try to figure out how to deal with them on the back end and how we think about the results. Thank you.